The night is quiet, but the world Lucky Luciano built is still awake. Neon lights wash over Manhattan streets, tracing invisible borders that once belonged to him. Beneath the hum of the city, the same mechanics of power still turn: extortion, loyalty, betrayal, profit, the human hunger for control wrapped in 1,000 modern disguises. It's been decades since the man himself died, yet his fingerprints remain on every criminal enterprise that calls itself organized. Before there was a mafia boardroom, before there was the idea of a crime syndicate, there was a man who believed chaos could be turned into order, and profit could be treated as religion. The story begins not with gunfire, but with vision. Salvatore Lucania, better known as Lucky Luciano, was not the loudest or the most brutal gangster of his era. He was the one who thought. In a world ruled by impulse and revenge, he built an empire on strategy. Where others saw turf, he saw systems. Where others enforced obedience with bullets, he engineered loyalty through structure. Luciano wasn't merely a mobster, he was a reformer of the underworld. The architect who transformed crime into a business model. But to understand Luciano, you have to understand the century that made him. The Great Depression had gutted America's economy, leaving millions desperate. Prohibition had turned alcohol into gold, creating an illicit economy that rivaled Wall Street in wealth and risk. Immigrant neighborhoods, Italian, Jewish, Irish, were battlegrounds where survival meant aligning with the right men or dying forgotten. In this dark ecosystem, Lucky rose like a cold-blooded mathematician of the streets. He learned the language of fear, loyalty, and betrayal before he could spell his own name in English. His genius was not in violence but in human psychology. Luciano knew how to read weakness, how to anticipate greed, how to control emotion in others while suppressing it in himself. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room of killers and make them believe in a future. That was his secret weapon, the ability to make men think he was their partner, while in truth, they were his instruments. His voice was calm, his smile practiced, and behind that charm lived a cold precision that could turn friendship into leverage in a single breath. As the documentary opens, we fade between timelines, 1930s Manhattan glimmering under Prohibition wealth, and present-day cities where organized crime still operates under his template. Every deal, every hierarchy, every code of silence bears the ghost of Lucky Luciano. His empire may have fallen, but his method survived. His name became less of a legend and more of a doctrine, the Luciano method, a blueprint that every future Don, from Sicily to Las Vegas to Hong Kong, would follow. And yet, beneath the mythology lies the man, a Sicilian immigrant who remade himself into America's criminal visionary. His path wasn't just about power. It was about control, over others, over fate, and ultimately, over history itself. To many, he was a villain. To others, a necessary evil. To the underworld, he was a teacher, one who didn't just rule his generation but trained the next. This film is not simply about Lucky Luciano's life. It is about the architecture of crime itself, how one man's mind created a framework that still shapes corruption, politics, and organized power today. It is about mentorship in darkness, the transmission of wisdom between devils, and the question that lingers long after his death: did Lucky Luciano create the mafia, or did the mafia create Lucky Luciano? As the opening titles fade, a voice echoes through the shadows of history, calm, confident, immortal: I didn't invent the mafia. I just made it run like a business. The story of Lucky Luciano cannot begin with his rise, it must begin with the chaos he inherited. Before there was structure, before the commission, before the mafia was even called organized, there was a city drowning in blood. New York in the early 1900s was not the empire of shining towers it would later become. It was a battlefield of ambition, ruled by fear, desperation, and the immigrant struggle for survival. The underworld of that era wasn't a single network, it was a fragmented warzone. Italians, Jews, and Irish gangs carved up the city block by block, each fighting for control of gambling, bootlegging, and extortion rackets. Loyalty was fleeting. Betrayal was currency. Every handshake carried the weight of a hidden knife. In the heart of this chaos were the mustache Petes, the old-school Sicilian dons who believed crime was a family affair, bound by blood and old country values. They refused to trust outsiders, especially the younger generation born and raised in America. To them, the underworld was sacred, to be preserved, not reimagined. They valued secrecy, ritual, and rigid hierarchy, operating as though they still ruled the hills of Palermo rather than the streets of Manhattan. But America was changing faster than they could understand. Their traditions were suffocating under modern ambition, and their refusal to adapt created cracks in their empire, cracks a visionary like Luciano would one day exploit. Meanwhile, across the river, Jewish and Irish syndicates were developing their own criminal ecosystems. Arnold Rothstein, known as the Brain, had already begun turning street crime into organized finance. He laundered illegal money through legitimate fronts, teaching the art of invisible profit. On the docks, Irish gangs controlled the unions, while Jewish gamblers dominated underground casinos. But there was no cooperation, only turf wars and fragile truces. The underworld was profitable, yes, but unstable. One wrong move could trigger a war that burned through the city's veins overnight. In this chaotic melting pot, young immigrants like Luciano observed the madness with cold fascination. The lessons were everywhere: power meant nothing without organization, and fear without profit was wasted energy. He saw the mustache Petes clinging to the past, refusing to share power with the ambitious young mobsters who spoke English better than Sicilian. He saw how racism and pride divided the gangs that could have ruled together. And above all, he saw how greed was destroying everyone, because no one knew how to manage it. To Luciano, it was like watching kings destroy their own thrones. It was madness disguised as honor. The city itself mirrored this disunity. The Lower East Side, with its crowded tenements, was a furnace of crime and poverty. Prohibition had turned every alley into a black market economy. Speakeasies flourished behind secret doors. Police were bought and sold like stock shares. Violence was not an exception, it was the rhythm of survival. Each neighborhood had its own crime boss, its own set of rules, and its own soldiers ready to kill at a word. In such an environment, the mafia was not yet a single organism. It was a swarm, unpredictable, hungry, and self-destructive. The seeds of transformation were already being planted. A few young gangsters began questioning the old ways. Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, they looked beyond ethnic lines and saw something larger, the potential of cooperation over tradition. They began thinking like businessmen, not warlords. They studied men like Rothstein, who taught them that money wasn't about violence, it was about influence. Luciano watched, learned, and began to imagine a world where crime could be efficient. He would not rule like a don from Sicily. He would rule like a CEO. But to reach that point, the old world had to die. The Castellamarese War, the bloody conflict between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, would become the purge that cleared the path for reform. The war was the ultimate expression of the mafia's sickness, two aging bosses fighting for dominance while their soldiers bled in the streets. Luciano fought in that war, but even then, he was already thinking ahead, thinking of what would come after. He saw that victory would mean nothing unless someone restructured everything. Crime needed laws of its own, a hierarchy not based on bloodlines but on competence. By the late 1920s, as America stumbled through the Great Depression, Luciano had already diagnosed the disease of his world. The old mafia was too emotional, too tribal, too small-minded. To survive in modern America, it had to evolve, to shed its skin like a serpent. The city needed order. The underworld needed leadership. And the man to provide both was rising quietly from the shadows, studying the chaos he would soon control. When we look back at that era, it's easy to see why Lucky Luciano became inevitable. He was born from disorder, forged in betrayal, and driven by a vision that transcended the violence around him. The world before Lucky Luciano was a jungle of power without purpose. The world after him would become an empire of organized greed. He didn't create corruption, he perfected it. Salvatore Lucania was born into poverty, not the kind measured in coins, but in opportunity. Sicily, at the dawn of the 20th century, was a land haunted by centuries of feudal oppression. The powerful lived behind stone walls, the poor lived in dust. For families like the Lucanias, America wasn't just a destination, it was a myth, a whispered promise that across the ocean lay streets paved with gold. But when the family arrived in New York in 1906, those streets turned out to be soaked in sweat, blood, and broken dreams. The Lower East Side was a world within a world, overcrowded tenements stacked like tombs, children begging in alleys, and crime waiting at every corner to recruit the desperate. In this world, the young Salvatore became Charlie. He Americanized his name, not out of pride but survival. He learned quickly that to belong, you had to adapt. He was a small boy with sharp eyes and a calculating silence. While others fought for scraps, Luciano observed. He watched how the powerful carried themselves, not just the gangsters, but the businessmen, the ward bosses, the corrupt cops. He studied power the way some study scripture. To him, power wasn't luck, it was learned behavior. And soon, he would learn it well. By the age of 10, Luciano was already running errands for petty criminals. He carried envelopes, messages, sometimes contraband, always careful, always quiet. The streets became his classroom. He learned that violence could earn respect, but intelligence could buy freedom. He began running protection rackets at school, charging wealthier Jewish kids a few cents a week to ensure they weren't beaten by neighborhood bullies. One of those boys was Meyer Lansky, the same Lansky who would later become his lifelong partner in empire. It was an odd friendship, the quiet Jewish math prodigy and the tough Sicilian street kid. But even then, both understood that brains and muscle together could rule a city. Luciano's teenage years were a blur of hustles. He drifted between gang jobs, bootlegging, petty theft, gambling. Arrested more than once, he learned how to keep his mouth shut, a skill that would later save his life countless times. The police knew his name, but never his full story. He was clever enough to stay just below the radar, never the shooter, always the arranger. That was his nature, invisible control. His nickname, Lucky, was born after a violent kidnapping in 1929, when rivals abducted him, beat him, and left him for dead on Staten Island. He survived, scarred and furious, but alive. From that day forward, Lucky wasn't just a name, it was a prophecy. In those early years, Luciano's greatest education came not from books, but from observation. He studied the psychology of fear, how men reacted under pressure, how loyalty could be bought or broken, how one well-timed favor could become a lifelong debt. He watched the old bosses demand respect through terror, and he understood something they didn't: fear fades, structure lasts. The mustache Pete's ruled by superstition and ego. Luciano wanted something cleaner, something sustainable. He wanted a system that could run itself, even when the boss wasn't watching. As the 1920s roared in, opportunity arrived in liquid form: alcohol. Prohibition transformed every street gangster into a potential millionaire. The country was thirsty, and Luciano intended to quench that thirst with ruthless efficiency. He began working under Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, a man as greedy as he was paranoid. Luciano saw in Masuria both a mentor and a warning. The old man's arrogance was a relic of the old world. He demanded tribute, loyalty, and unquestioned obedience, but he lacked vision. Luciano gave him his loyalty on paper, but his ambition was already moving beyond him. He surrounded himself with thinkers: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello. They were young, pragmatic, and American. Together, they began to sketch a new kind of underworld, one without national boundaries, one that viewed crime not as a family tradition but as an industry. They wore suits, not rags. They read stock reports as closely as they read police bulletins. Their meetings weren't just about rackets, they were about efficiency, strategy, scalability. Luciano was learning to be more than a gangster, he was learning to be a manager of men. But behind the business-like veneer, there was still blood. Luciano's world was not built in boardrooms but in alleys. He could smile in one moment and give a death order the next. He believed in the balance between charm and cruelty, too much of one, and a man became weak, too much of the other, and he became reckless. His code was simple: loyalty above sentiment, order above pride. Those who couldn't follow it were removed, permanently. As he grew in power, so did his vision. He imagined a future where the mafia could rival corporations, where crime could operate like Wall Street, disciplined, discreet, and lucrative. Every moment of his youth, from the dirt streets of Sicily to the neon alleys of Manhattan, had shaped that dream. He had learned patience from poverty, adaptability from immigration, and ruthlessness from survival. By the time Luciano reached his mid-20s, he was no longer just another street hustler. He had become the mind of the new generation, fluent in the language of crime and capitalism alike. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to design a system that could rule itself. The rise of a street kid was complete, but the empire he envisioned was only beginning to take form. The city was still fragmented, the old bosses still clinging to power, and the blood of the Castellamarese war was yet to spill. But within the mind of Lucky Luciano, the blueprint of organized crime had already been written, precise, logical, inevitable. The boy from Sicily was about to teach America how to be a gangster. The streets had made Luciano cunning, but it was his mentors who made him strategic. Every great mind in crime has a teacher, and for Lucky Luciano, that education came from two men who represented the extremes of his world: Arnold Rothstein, the criminal philosopher, and Meyer Lansky, the prodigy of numbers. Together, they became the architects of a new kind of thinking, a transformation from gangsterism to organized enterprise. This was not about knives in alleys anymore, it was about systems, codes, and understanding the psychology of loyalty. Arnold Rothstein was the man who taught Luciano that crime was business. Known as the Brain, Rothstein was calm, elegant, and terrifyingly intelligent, a gambler who didn't bet with dice, but with people. He had fixed the 1919 World Series, laundered millions through fake corporations, and bribed officials with the same ease others bought cigars. When Luciano met him in his early 20s, he found not a criminal, but a businessman with an aura of calm power. Rothstein rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, men listened. His first lesson to Luciano was deceptively simple: you don't need to kill your enemies, Charlie. Buy them. This idea struck Luciano like lightning. He had spent his youth watching older dons like Joe Masuria and Maranzano rule through fear, using blood as currency. But Rothstein operated differently. He turned enemies into assets and lawmen into partners. He didn't run from power, he infiltrated it. Rothstein showed Luciano how to use influence instead of intimidation, and how to make corruption respectable. Through him, Luciano learned how to hide in plain sight, wearing tailored suits, dining in the same restaurants as judges and bankers. It was camouflage through class. Meyer Lansky was the other side of that education. If Rothstein was the philosopher, Lansky was the mathematician. He understood numbers the way Luciano understood people. Together, they formed an unbreakable partnership, one coldly analytical, the other instinctively psychological. Lansky taught Luciano how to manage finances, how to turn dirty money into clean profit, and how to make gambling, extortion, and bootlegging operate like legitimate enterprises. Lansky's genius was structure. He treated every racket like an investment, every man like a moving part in a machine. Luciano admired him not just as a friend, but as a reflection of what the mafia could become: organized, disciplined, and far-reaching. Under Rothstein and Lansky's influence, Luciano began to redefine his own identity. He no longer saw himself as a thug, but as a leader, a businessman who happened to deal in illegal goods. His ambitions grew more precise. He started to believe that the mafia could be re-engineered into a corporation, one that outlasted its founders, immune to chaos. But to achieve that, he had to reshape its culture from the inside out. That meant breaking the sacred traditions of the old world mafia, and for that, he would have to risk everything. The old-school dons, the mustache Petes, still clung to the values of Sicily, bloodline loyalty, rigid hierarchy, and total isolation from outsiders. They despised cooperation with non-Italians. To them, partnering with Jewish or Irish gangs was betrayal. But Luciano saw beyond ethnicity. He saw efficiency. He saw profit. He knew that America wasn't Sicily, and the mafia's survival depended on adaptation. While men like Maranzano obsessed over rituals, Luciano focused on results. He didn't care where the money came from, as long as it flowed. He began quietly spreading his philosophy among younger gangsters, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, men who, like him, were tired of living in the shadow of outdated traditions. Luciano called it modern thinking. He emphasized loyalty not to blood, but to success. Omerta, the code of silence, remained sacred, but he stripped it of superstition. It wasn't about honor anymore, it was about survival and profit. If the old mafia was a religion, Luciano was turning it into a corporation. Through calculated alliances, Luciano built a circle of influence that stretched across New York. Each connection served a purpose: political favors from Costello's contacts in City Hall, financial systems from Lansky's Jewish network, manpower from Anastasia's fearsome hitmen. Luciano never trusted anyone fully, but he learned to trust the system he was creating. It was a network of loyalty built not on friendship, but on mutual dependency, a balance of power so intricate that betrayal became illogical. If one man fell, everyone lost. It was the perfect control mechanism. But this evolution didn't come without blood. Luciano understood that progress always offends tradition. The old Don saw his new ideas as blasphemy, a betrayal of the Sicilian soul. And Luciano, ever the strategist, knew that reform sometimes required destruction. Behind the scenes, he began planning to eliminate the old order, not impulsively, but methodically. He began dividing loyalties, whispering promises, setting traps. He was not just preparing for war, he was preparing for rebirth. The transformation from street soldier to strategist was complete. Luciano had forged his own moral code, a twisted but consistent philosophy that justified everything he did. He believed that fear should serve order, not chaos. That loyalty should be earned through opportunity, not intimidation. That killing was not the purpose of power, but the tax one paid to maintain it. This was the foundation of his empire, the psychology of the modern mafia. By 1930, Luciano's lessons from Rothstein and Lansky had matured into a vision, a syndicate that transcended bloodlines, governed by rules, profits, and balance. The mafia would no longer be an archaic brotherhood, it would become an institution. The world around him still believed crime was instinct. Luciano knew better. Crime, like business, could be taught, refined, and exported. It could have structure. It could have strategy. He didn't yet call it the commission. That would come later. But the idea, the seed of that concept, was born in these years of mentorship, betrayal, and cold learning. Luciano had graduated from the school of blood and loyalty, and the world's most dangerous lesson was about to be put into practice. The age of the old dons was ending. The age of organized crime was about to begin. By 1931, New York's underworld was drenched in blood and paranoia. The Castellamarese War had torn the mafia apart. Two old-world titans, Joe, the boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, had turned the streets into a chessboard of corpses. For years, Luciano played both sides, appearing loyal to Masuria while secretly communicating with Maranzano. He wasn't betraying one for the other, he was dismantling the old world itself. When the smoke finally cleared, both men would be dead, and Luciano would stand alone as the man who had rewritten the rules of crime. But victory, in his mind, wasn't about survival, it was about creation. He was ready to build something bigger, colder, and far more efficient than the chaotic families that had come before. He was ready to build the commission. The idea was revolutionary, a government for organized crime. No more random wars, no more personal vendettas. Luciano believed that gangsters needed structure just as much as any legitimate business. Every family would have autonomy, but major decisions, assassinations, business territories, political alliances, would be handled collectively by a governing council. It was the underworld's version of a corporate boardroom. And at the top of this new empire, Luciano would sit not as a king, but as a chairman. The commission was born from blood. Luciano orchestrated the assassinations of both his mentors and rivals, first Masuria, then Maranzano. Both died believing they were untouchable, both outplayed by the same quiet strategist they had underestimated. With their deaths, the feudal mafia died with them. Luciano immediately began rebuilding the structure from the ground up. The five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, were established as the core of this new order, each with defined territories and leaders who reported to the commission. It was a symphony of power, balanced through fear and diplomacy. In smoky rooms across Manhattan, Luciano gathered his chosen few. Frank Costello, his political diplomat, Meyer Lansky, his financial genius, Vito Genovese, his ruthless enforcer. These men weren't subordinates, they were shareholders in the world's most profitable illegal corporation. Luciano laid out the rules: there would be no boss of bosses. Each family would have representation, each decision made through negotiation, not bloodshed. It was a democracy built on greed. For the first time, the mafia operated not as warring clans, but as a national syndicate. What Luciano created in those dimly lit meetings wasn't just organization, it was order. His model drew inspiration from the corporate systems of America's biggest industries. Where businessmen used board meetings, he used sit-downs. Where CEOs had distribution networks, he had smuggling routes. He introduced record-keeping, standardized profit cuts, and even conflict resolution procedures. Violence became regulated, permitted only when necessary. Murder was no longer a sign of strength, it was a cost of doing business. The genius of the commission wasn't only in its design but in its psychological impact. By giving every boss a voice, Luciano neutralized ambition. No single man could declare war without risking collective retaliation. Every family had something to lose, and that fear of mutual destruction became the glue that held them together. Luciano understood that in crime, just as in politics, peace is rarely built on morality. It is built on balance. Behind the scenes, Luciano's influence extended far beyond the Italian mafia. Through Lansky, he formed alliances with Jewish syndicates, ensuring smooth cooperation in gambling and narcotics. Through Costello, he infiltrated the political machine of Tammany Hall, buying judges and police commissioners like assets on a ledger. He treated corruption as infrastructure, not chaos, but policy. He had created not a gang, but an empire hidden in plain sight. The commission's reach quickly expanded beyond New York. Luciano helped broker peace between Chicago's outfit, led by Al Capone's successors, and the East Coast syndicates. Together, they formed an invisible network stretching from Havana to Kansas City to Los Angeles. Every major criminal enterprise in America was now connected by a shared system of governance, tribute, and regulation. For the first time, organized crime was truly organized, nationalized, standardized, and profitable. Yet within the shadow of progress lurked paranoia. The system Luciano built depended on human greed, and greed is never satisfied. Some bosses resented his influence, whispering that he had replaced the old tyranny of the mustache Pete's with a new one of his own making. Luciano knew it, and he didn't deny it. Control, to him, was never about titles, it was about perception. He didn't need to call himself boss of bosses. The mere fact that no one dared to question him proved that he already was. The commission also marked a turning point in Luciano's psychology. He had transcended the identity of a gangster. In his mind, he had become a statesman of the underworld, the man who civilized crime. He saw himself as a reformer, not a criminal. When journalists later called him the father of modern organized crime, he reportedly smirked and said, "Someone had to bring some brains to this business." His ego had fused with his creation. To Luciano, the commission wasn't just a structure, it was his immortality. But this new empire came with a curse. The more efficient the system became, the more invisible it was to outsiders, and that made it far more dangerous. The government didn't understand what it was facing. Prosecutors saw isolated crimes, not a syndicate with a board of directors. Luciano had created a system that could regenerate even if he were removed. Every rule he wrote, every meeting he held, every alliance he brokered would outlive him. In that sense, the commission was both his greatest success and his greatest mistake. He had made himself replaceable. By the mid-1930s, organized crime was more profitable than ever. Money flowed through nightclubs, casinos, ports, and unions, all under Luciano's silent control. But while his empire expanded, the eyes of the law began to turn toward him. His name appeared in whispered reports, in backroom conversations at the mayor's office, in the files of a young prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. For now, though, Luciano was untouchable, the untitled king of an invisible kingdom. In a world that worshipped violence, he had built order. In a culture obsessed with power, he had built structure. And in an empire defined by loyalty and betrayal, lucky Luciano had built something that seemed eternal, a machine that would run long after its creator was gone. After the commission was established, lucky Luciano stood at the summit of the underworld, but he knew something the others didn't. Power without continuity is temporary. To him, the true mark of a leader wasn't just ruling an empire, it was training others to sustain it. Luciano understood that the survival of organized crime depended on education, the passing down of rules, instincts, and the art of control. He had created order, but order meant nothing without successors who could understand it. Thus began the unseen chapter of his reign, the training of the next generation of crime lords. Luciano's approach to mentorship was as deliberate as it was chilling. He didn't believe in speeches or moral lessons, he believed in demonstration. Every sit-down, every deal, every betrayal was a classroom. To him, the mafia was an institution of power where mistakes meant death and loyalty was a measurable currency. The men he shaped weren't sons, they were investments. Among them were the faces that would later define the golden age of organized crime: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino, and even younger figures like Joe Adonis. Each one would become a boss in his own right, but all carried fragments of Luciano's philosophy, fragments forged in his psychological workshop of crime. Frank Costello was the diplomat, the man who would later be called the Prime Minister of the underworld. Luciano saw in him a master of influence. Costello didn't intimidate, he persuaded. He built bridges to judges, senators, and police chiefs, transforming corruption into partnership. Luciano encouraged him to operate not as a gangster, but as a politician, calm, rational, and indispensable. To Luciano, Costello embodied the idea that violence was primitive, but access was eternal. He was the lesson in subtlety. Then there was Vito Genovese, ambitious, cunning, and utterly ruthless. Luciano saw in him the fire of the old world, the cold-blooded will that the younger generation sometimes lacked. Genovese was not a man of patience, he was a predator. Luciano both admired and feared him. To keep Genovese close was to keep danger within reach, but to push him away was suicide. Luciano taught him discipline, or at least tried to. Violence, he told Genovese once, is a language. You don't shout it, you whisper it. But Genovese would never truly learn restraint, and that flaw would one day come back to haunt both teacher and student. Albert Anastasia was another kind of prodigy, a creature of pure terror. Known as the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia ran Murder Incorporated, the mafia's enforcement arm, under Luciano's oversight. He was proof that Luciano's system worked. Every empire needs both philosophers and soldiers. Luciano taught Anastasia not to kill for pleasure, but for policy. Every bullet had to serve purpose. Every corpse had to mean something. Through Anastasia, Luciano transformed murder from a personal act into an institutional mechanism, a form of management. Perhaps Luciano's greatest legacy, however, lay in his mentorship of Carlo Gambino, a quiet, patient man who watched more than he spoke. Gambino learned from Luciano that survival was the highest art. He studied diplomacy from Costello, ruthlessness from Genovese, and strategy from Luciano himself. Years later, when Gambino took control of the most powerful crime family in America, he would rule not through bloodshed, but through patience, the truest reflection of his teacher's wisdom. Luciano's leadership style was psychological. He never raised his voice, never displayed anger in public. He preferred to plant ideas in the minds of his protégés and watch them bloom, or explode. He was the kind of mentor who turned fear into respect without ever needing to prove it physically. His protégés often described him as calm, even fatherly, but beneath that composure was steel. He believed in teaching by consequence. Mistakes weren't corrected with lectures, they were corrected with silence, or disappearance. Training the next generation wasn't just about maintaining control, it was about ensuring adaptability. Luciano knew that the world was changing. Prohibition was nearing its end. The narcotics trade was rising. Law enforcement was evolving. He warned his lieutenants that crime, like business, required innovation. When the laws change, he once said, we change the business. This adaptability became the cornerstone of his students' success. When bootlegging collapsed, they pivoted to gambling, labor racketeering, and drugs. When the government cracked down on local operations, they went international. Luciano had taught them to think like economists, not thugs. But his mentorship had a darker dimension. Luciano didn't just train men to lead, he trained them to manipulate. He showed them how to exploit loyalty, how to turn friendship into leverage, and how to maintain control through controlled chaos. He believed that unpredictability was a form of power, that if a man could never fully read you, he could never betray you effectively. In his presence, even his closest allies were never sure where they stood. That uncertainty was his greatest weapon. He also taught through ritual. The initiation ceremonies, though rooted in old Sicilian tradition, became more psychological under his rule. The burning of a saint's image in one's hand, the oath of silence, the symbolic blood, all of it was theater designed to embed fear and loyalty at a subconscious level. Luciano understood that men could break promises, but they could not easily break beliefs. By merging superstition with structure, he created a cult of obedience disguised as honor. Luciano's training methods extended beyond the mafia itself. Through alliances with Jewish and Irish mobsters, he encouraged cross-cultural mentorship. He wanted his protégés to understand negotiation beyond ethnicity. In the backrooms of Manhattan's finest hotels, he would arrange meetings between Costello and Lansky, between Anastasia and Siegel, forging relationships that blurred the old lines of race and tradition. The underworld was evolving into a global network, and Luciano's apprentices would become its ambassadors. The irony was that in training others to sustain the empire, Luciano was also planting the seeds of his own eventual downfall. Each student carried not just his methods, but his ambition. Genovese, in particular, studied him too well, learned how to bide his time, how to strike when others least expected. Luciano had built a system that could run without him, but that also meant it could turn against him. Yet, he never doubted his vision. For him, legacy was worth more than safety. By the mid-1930s, the next generation was ready. They spoke with Luciano's logic, acted with his patience, and ruled with his system. The mafia was no longer a collection of thugs, it was a self-sustaining organism. Luciano had created not just leaders, but a lineage. Each of his protégés would go on to run empires of their own, spreading his teachings like a dark religion. He once said to Costello, over a glass of bourbon, the trick isn't to rule forever. It's to make them think the system can't work without you. That, in essence, was Luciano's true genius. He didn't just build an empire, he trained the architects who would rebuild it endlessly. His reign had become a classroom, his life a textbook, and his name a doctrine whispered in every corner of organized crime. The structure of Lucky Luciano's empire rested on more than bullets and business. It was held together by something far older, a philosophy, a code, a system of silence that defined who lived and who died. This was omerta, the law above all laws. To the outside world, it was simply the mafia's rule of secrecy, but to those inside, it was a religion, a creed of loyalty and fear that governed every thought, every word, every heartbeat. Luciano didn't invent omerta, but he refined it. He stripped it of superstition and turned it into a psychological weapon, one capable of controlling men long after the gun smoke cleared. In the old world of Sicily, omerta was rooted in honor, the belief that silence was purity, and betrayal was a sin punishable by death. In America, Luciano transformed it into strategy. He understood that silence wasn't about morality, it was about control. A man who couldn't speak couldn't expose. A man who didn't question couldn't rebel. Under Luciano, omerta became less of a vow and more of a form of conditioning. It was drilled into every soldier from the moment they joined the family. They didn't just swear to silence, they learned to believe in it. Every initiation ceremony reinforced this idea. The ritual was deliberately designed to blend faith with fear. A saint's image was placed in the initiate's palm, set aflame, and crushed while the oath was recited, "If I betray my friends, may my soul burn as this saint burns." It wasn't just symbolism, it was psychological imprinting. Luciano understood the human mind, how belief, repetition, and fear could shape identity. Once a man swore the oath, he wasn't merely part of the mafia became part of him. Betrayal wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Luciano's version of omerta operated on two levels. The first was practical, the suppression of information. No one outside the organization was to be trusted, not police, not politicians, not even family. The second was emotional, the suppression of individuality. Every man learned that his value came only through loyalty. To disobey the hierarchy wasn't just rebellion, it was self-erasure. This dual layer of control, silence and submission, created a society within a society. It was invisible to outsiders but binding to all within. He enforced this code not through constant punishment, but through selective example. When betrayal occurred, Luciano made sure the retribution was surgical and symbolic. The body of a traitor wasn't just a warning, it was theater. One example could silence 100 tongues. Men whispered about the fate of Mad Dog Call, gunned down after defying the syndicate, or about the unspoken rules that followed any breach. These stories traveled faster than orders ever could. Luciano didn't need to remind his men to be loyal, fear did that for him. Yet, his brilliance was in making omerta feel noble. He made his soldiers believe that they were part of something sacred, a fraternity of men bound by higher law. He romanticized the code as heritage, calling it, the one thing that separates us from the animals. In reality, it was a leash disguised as honor. He gave his men the illusion of dignity, but it was really obedience. This was the paradox of Luciano's empire, loyalty looked like faith, but it was submission, silence looked like pride, but it was control. Even his allies outside the mafia respected the code. Jewish and Irish associates like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello adopted similar systems of secrecy within their operations. Luciano's influence reshaped the entire criminal ecosystem of America. Police informants became rare. Witnesses disappeared. Trials collapsed from lack of testimony. The law was powerless against a network where words had no value and silence was currency. Omerta was more than a rule, it was a psychological architecture. It created predictability in an unpredictable world. Luciano understood that if he could make loyalty a reflex, not a choice, he would never lose control. Every interaction within his empire was governed by this logic. Soldiers spoke in coded language, lieutenants never knew the full extent of operations, and only a handful of men could reach the top layer of communication. Information moved vertically, never sideways. Compartmentalization was survival. But omerta wasn't just about what men couldn't say, it was about what they couldn't feel. Emotion was weakness. Compassion could lead to mistakes. Luciano encouraged his men to detach from the moral weight of their actions. "We're not killers," he once told an associate, "we're accountants of risk." In that cold, logical world, morality was irrelevant. Loyalty was the only virtue, and disobedience the only sin. Still, beneath the calm surface, cracks were forming. The more organized the mafia became, the more it demanded blind obedience, and blind obedience breeds resentment. Some younger soldiers, especially those born in America, began questioning the old rituals. They admired Luciano's modern thinking but saw the code as archaic. They wanted power without the chains of superstition. Luciano recognized this tension and worked to keep it under control. He modernized the language of loyalty, presenting omerta not as religion but as policy. "This isn't about honor," he'd say. "It's about insurance." He made men believe that silence wasn't just noble, it was profitable. His understanding of human psychology made the code nearly unbreakable. Even under threat of prison or death, his men rarely talked. They feared not only retribution but exile, the loss of identity that came with betraying the family. For many, the mafia was the only world they knew. To break omerta was to vanish from that world entirely. The FBI would later note that among all criminal organizations, none displayed such consistent silence under pressure. That was Luciano's genius, he had turned fear into loyalty and loyalty into faith. Yet, as with all systems built on control, omerta would eventually be tested. As law enforcement evolved and men like Thomas Dewey rose to power, cracks would begin to form. Some would break. Others would vanish before they could. But in the 1930s, under Luciano's reign, the code stood firm, as sacred as any religion, as powerful as any government. It was the invisible spine of the empire, the software that kept the machine running. For Luciano, omerta was not just a law of silence, it was his masterpiece of manipulation. It allowed him to rule without constant violence, to command without constant presence. Every man in his organization, from the lowest soldier to the highest capo, carried the weight of that invisible chain. It was fear turned into philosophy, obedience turned into identity. When historians later called him the father of organized crime, they often pointed to the commission, the business structure, the empire. But those were merely the hardware. The true power of Luciano's legacy, the one that would outlive him by generations, was the code he perfected. It made the mafia immortal. And as long as men kept their mouths shut, Lucky Luciano's ghost would never die. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had transformed the American underworld into a machine, sleek, profitable, and terrifyingly efficient. The blood-soaked chaos of the old mafia had been replaced by a new kind of empire, an invisible corporation with its own hierarchy, rules, and balance sheets. At its center was Luciano, the calm executive of crime. But his genius wasn't just in organization, it was in vision. He saw that the future of power lay not in fear, but in business. And business meant expansion. The next phase of his empire would not be built with bullets, but with profit, through the systematic industrialization of vice. Luciano's empire was diversified like a Fortune 500 company. His investments stretched across every sinful corner of American life: prostitution, gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and unions. Each was a department with its own managers, networks, and ledgers. What tied them together was Luciano's guiding principle: control without exposure. He didn't need his name on anything, he just needed the money to flow upward. Every racket was a gear in the larger machine, spinning in silence, feeding the empire. The cornerstone of this expansion was prostitution. It was a business both ancient and resilient, and Luciano saw in it an untapped gold mine. He applied the same organizational logic that had revolutionized the mafia. Gone were the scattered brothels and independent madams. Under his direction, prostitution became an industry. He standardized operations, setting prices, controlling supply chains, even managing health protocols to minimize police interference. He called it the combination. Every working girl, every pimp, every brothel operator paid into the system. For a percentage, they received protection, access, and security. It was criminal franchising before the term existed. But prostitution was only one stream of income. Gambling became the true engine of Luciano's wealth. Partnering with Meyer Lansky, he turned illegal betting into a national enterprise. From high-end casinos in Florida and Havana to underground clubs in New York and Chicago, Luciano built an ecosystem of games, dealers, and cash laundering networks. He used legitimate businesses, restaurants, trucking firms, laundries, as financial fronts, moving money seamlessly across state lines. The brilliance of the system lay in its invisibility. The public saw glamour and entertainment, beneath it, Luciano's empire was counting every dollar. Meanwhile, narcotics began to enter the equation, quietly, cautiously. Luciano understood that drugs were dangerous, not just morally but logistically. They attracted heat. But the profits were irresistible. Using his contacts in Italy and Turkey, Luciano helped establish a transatlantic pipeline of heroin smuggling. The product moved through Marseille, across the Atlantic, and into American ports controlled by his longshoremen's unions. It was distributed through the same networks that once moved bootleg whiskey. The key to success was efficiency. Luciano treated narcotics like luxury imports, managing them with the precision of an international corporation. The profits flooded his coffers, and the operation became the foundation for what would later be known as the French Connection. To protect his growing business empire, Luciano needed influence beyond the streets. This brought him into the world of labor unions, one of his most cunning plays. Through men like Louis, Lepka, Buckleter and Albert Anastasia, Luciano infiltrated unions across industries, dockworkers, truckers, garment workers. Controlling labor meant controlling the economy itself. If a company resisted his rackets, strikes could paralyze entire sectors. Politicians learned quickly that opposing Luciano's men meant losing elections, as shipments stalled and ports shut down. Through bribery, intimidation, and strategic generosity, Luciano turned unions into both shield and weapon. But Luciano's greatest innovation was integration, the seamless fusion of illegal and legal economies. He used accountants and lawyers the way soldiers once used Tommy guns. Every illegal operation had a clean counterpart. Casinos had hotels, bootlegging routes had trucking firms, unions had investment portfolios. Money flowed like a river, starting dirty and ending pure. He called it the circle, cash laundering that turned vice into legitimacy. In many ways, Luciano anticipated the modern concept of organized white-collar crime. He wasn't simply breaking laws, he was rewriting the economic order. Psychologically, this period revealed Luciano's most complex layer. To the public, he was a ghost, a rumor whispered in newsrooms and police precincts. To his men, he was the embodiment of calm dominance. He rarely appeared in photographs, never flaunted wealth, never issued open threats. His power was quiet, his control absolute. He ruled not through presence but through structure. "If I have to shout," he once said, "then the system's broken." Luciano had mastered the art of delegation. He no longer dirtied his hands with operations, he directed them like a conductor leading an orchestra. Lansky handled the finances. Costello managed political connections. Anastasia enforced discipline. Genovese oversaw narcotics. Each knew their role, and each feared disappointing him more than the law. The efficiency was astounding, crime functioning with the precision of a corporation, its executives sitting in nightclubs and hotel suites instead of boardrooms. Yet, beneath this smooth surface, there was tension. The empire's success drew attention, not just from law enforcement, but from within. Some bosses resented the growing commercialization of crime. To them, Luciano's reforms had made the mafia too impersonal, too dependent on money rather than honor. The old guard whispered that the soul of the mafia had been sold. Luciano ignored them. To him, sentiment was weakness. "Honor doesn't pay the bills," he said once, dismissively. Still, he wasn't blind to danger. He knew that visibility was his greatest threat. So he surrounded himself with politicians, lawyers, and police officials, all on his payroll. He cultivated an image of a businessman, a nightlife impresario, the gentleman gangster. He attended high society dinners, posed with celebrities, and moved through Manhattan like an invisible aristocrat. He believed he had finally done it, built a world where crime and respectability could coexist. But power, no matter how well constructed, invites opposition. The more Luciano expanded, the more he drew the attention of the one man who would become his nemesis, a young, relentless prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey represented the new America, clean, efficient, moralistic, and determined to crush the system Luciano had perfected. The irony was almost poetic. The same organizational discipline that made Luciano untouchable also made him traceable. Every network, every manager, every system left patterns, and Dewey was smart enough to follow them. For the moment, though, in 1935 and 1936, Luciano stood untouchable. The newspapers called him the man who runs New York. Behind every nightclub, every casino, every dockworker's paycheck, his shadow lingered. He had built the first truly modern criminal corporation, a structure so advanced that law enforcement barely understood it. The business of vice had become the business of civilization. And yet, history has a cruel symmetry. Every empire that perfects itself eventually reaches a point where its efficiency turns inward, where the very structure that guarantees control also ensures exposure. Luciano's empire was at its zenith, but unseen forces were already gathering against him, discontented protégés, moral crusaders, and the weight of his own ambition. The business of crime had made him a king. But kings, no matter how careful, eventually step into the light, and light, as Luciano would soon learn, reveals everything. By 1936, Lucky Luciano's empire stretched like a shadow over America. From the glittering clubs of Manhattan to the humid ports of New Orleans, from Havana's casinos to Chicago's backrooms, his influence was everywhere. The commission was strong, his lieutenants loyal, and his profits unmatched. Yet, beneath that calm surface, the first tremors of downfall were beginning to stir. The empire that had been built on logic, structure, and silence was about to face something Luciano could neither bribe nor outthink, the inevitability of exposure. The cracks began subtly. Whispers in the newspapers about the Vice King of New York. Rumors in political circles about judges and police officials who owed their fortunes to unseen benefactors. Luciano's attempt to live as a respectable businessman had backfired. The more refined his image became, the more visible he was. His brothels, once hidden behind fronts and coded transactions, had become the talk of the town. Even his allies in the press couldn't ignore the obvious: someone was running New York's criminal economy with precision. That someone had a name, and the law was about to learn it. Enter Thomas E. Dewey, the young, relentless special prosecutor who saw crime not as a street problem, but as a disease infecting the state itself. Dewey was everything Luciano despised: honest, ambitious, incorruptible. While most lawmen could be bought, Dewey could not. He didn't care about bribes, women, or power. He cared about headlines and justice. To him, Luciano was not just a criminal, he was a symbol. Taking him down would make Dewey a national hero. The hunt began. At first, Luciano laughed off Dewey's crusade. He'd seen prosecutors come and go, all falling prey to the same temptations: money or fear. But Dewey was different. He didn't go after the mob's soldiers or middlemen, he went after the system itself. His strategy was surgical. He began targeting the weakest link in Luciano's empire, the prostitution network known as the Combination. Dewey's office raided brothels across the city, arresting madams, pimps, and prostitutes. Instead of intimidating them into silence, he offered them protection, and something Luciano never could: redemption. Slowly, the wall of silence began to crack. Women who had lived in fear of the mob started to talk. Dewey's prosecutors recorded statements, collected ledgers, traced phone calls. The pattern was undeniable. Every brothel, every madam, every dollar led upward, to one name, Lucky Luciano. It was the first time in history that the mafia structure had been mapped like an organization chart. Dewey didn't need to prove Luciano's direct involvement, he just had to prove that he profited from the system. Meanwhile, inside the mafia, paranoia spread. Luciano's lieutenants could feel the pressure closing in. Frank Costello advised caution, to lay low, bribe the right politicians, and ride out the storm. Vito Genovese, however, saw opportunity. He began whispering in corners, suggesting that maybe Luciano's reign had gone on long enough. Some of Luciano's own protégés were already preparing for the possibility that their teacher would fall, and they wanted to be ready to inherit his throne. In March 1936, Dewey made his move. He ordered a series of coordinated raids across the city, seizing dozens of brothels and arresting over 100 people. The newspapers erupted with scandal. Vice ring linked to Luciano, blared the headlines. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. Dewey didn't need proof of Luciano's hand in every act, he just needed to show that he was the silent partner behind it all. For the first time, Luciano found himself not as the hunter, but as the hunted. The arrest came quietly. Luciano, ever calm, was at his suite in the Waldorf Astoria when detectives arrived. He didn't resist. He adjusted his tie, put out his cigarette, and smirked. "Tell Dewey," he said, "he finally got lucky." It was bravado, the kind of swagger that had carried him through decades of danger. But behind that smirk, Luciano knew the truth, this was the beginning of the end. His trial became a spectacle. Dewey built his case on the testimony of women, prostitutes and madams who had once lived under Luciano's rule. They spoke of coded messages, protection payments, and meetings in hotel rooms where orders were given. Dewey presented ledger books, phone records, and witnesses who painted Luciano as the unseen CEO of New York's vice industry. Luciano's lawyers argued that the charges were absurd, that no man could control an entire city's prostitution network. But the jury didn't need logic, they needed a villain. And Luciano, with his charm, silk suits, and reputation, fit the role perfectly. For the first time, the public saw the myth stripped away. The gentleman gangster, the suave reformer of crime, was now just another criminal facing justice. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, chanting his name. Some admired him, others despised him, but all were captivated. It was the performance of a lifetime, the stage where the king of the underworld met the full force of the law. Inside, Luciano remained composed. He listened to every witness, every accusation, without flinching. When asked about his role in the organization, he replied coolly, "I don't run anything. I'm retired." But the evidence was relentless. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin. The women who testified were broken, terrified, yet they spoke with a courage that even Luciano seemed to respect. He knew they had sealed his fate, but he didn't hate them. In his mind, they were simply doing what he had trained all his subordinates to do, survive. Behind closed doors, his empire began to fracture. Genovese maneuvered to take control, Costello sought political distance, and Lansky quietly shifted funds offshore. The empire Luciano had built to be indestructible was suddenly leaderless, paranoid, and divided. The commission operated, but without its architect, it was vulnerable. In June 1936, the verdict came. Luciano was found guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for that crime. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Dewey had done it. The newspapers hailed him as the man who defeated the mafia. Luciano stood expressionless as the sentence was read. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Well, it's just business." That moment marked the end of an era. The king of organized crime was gone, the empire decapitated, but the machine he built kept running. In a cruel twist of fate, his own efficiency ensured his irrelevance. The system he designed no longer needed him to function. Luciano was taken away in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing cameras and cheering reporters. But as he was led to the car, he turned to one of his guards and whispered, almost amused, "They think they've stopped me. They don't understand, I built something that can't die." He was right. The business of crime would survive his imprisonment, evolve under new leaders, and spread globally. But for now, lucky Luciano, the man who had turned chaos into order, was finally facing the consequences of his own creation. The fall had begun, and the world watched as the architect of the underworld was buried under the very system he perfected. The trial of Charles "Lucky" Luciano became more than a legal proceeding, it became a theater of morality. New York had seen many gangsters, many trials, but never one so drenched in symbolism. The courtroom itself seemed to vibrate with tension, packed with reporters, spectators, and politicians eager to witness the supposed end of the modern mafia. Outside, camera flashes burst like gunfire, immortalizing the downfall of a man who had once made the law his servant. Inside, the mood was electric, a clash between two opposing worlds, the cold rationality of organized crime and the moral fervor of American justice. Thomas E. Dewey entered the trial like a crusader. Every detail was orchestrated for spectacle, his sharp suits, his calm tone, his methodical cross-examinations. He didn't just want to convict Luciano, he wanted to destroy the myth of untouchable gangsters. To the public, he represented everything the mafia was not: discipline, integrity, and relentless persistence. Dewey's team presented their evidence with surgical precision, reconstructing the vast network of prostitution that Luciano allegedly controlled. They used ledgers, coded messages, and testimony from nearly 80 witnesses, most of them women whose lives had been twisted by the system Luciano helped build. These women became the heart of the prosecution's narrative. They were both victims and witnesses, their testimonies echoing through the chamber with trembling voices. One after another, they described the invisible chains that bound them, how protection payments flowed upward, how violence enforced silence, how money was funneled through layers of intermediaries until it reached the top. They spoke of the fear that haunted them, the men who watched them, and the belief that Luciano's reach extended into every corner of the city. For the defense, it was a nightmare. Luciano's lawyers argued there was no direct evidence connecting him to the crimes, no signed orders, no documented transactions. He was, they insisted, a successful gambler, not a criminal mastermind. They painted him as a scapegoat, a victim of political ambition. But the tide of public opinion was already against him. Dewey's speeches filled the newspapers, his face appeared in headlines daily, and his righteous tone turned the trial into a national morality play. Luciano's demeanor during the proceedings fascinated everyone. He sat perfectly still, expression unreadable, as if the entire spectacle bored him. He rarely spoke, never showed anger, and occasionally smiled, that same calm, knowing smirk that had once unnerved his rivals. When he did take the stand, he was eloquent, even charming. He denied everything with poise, calling the accusations fairy tales. Yet, behind his measured voice, there was a flicker of realization, the understanding that this was not a battle he could win through intimidation or manipulation. The courtroom was Dewey's world now, not his. The trial stretched for weeks, each day peeling away layers of Luciano's myth. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The witnesses' stories, however inconsistent, formed a mosaic of guilt. Luciano's network of frontmen and shell companies, once designed to protect him, now served as a roadmap for prosecutors. Dewey described him as the head of an octopus, whose tentacles reach into every street, every neighborhood, every vice. It was powerful imagery, and it stuck. As the weeks passed, the trial turned into a spectacle of irony. Luciano, the man who had professionalized crime, who had built his empire on logic and order, was now at the mercy of chaos, emotions, politics, and public opinion. The same system he had built to outsmart the law was now being used against him. Witnesses flipped. Associates turned. His silence, once his strength, became his greatest weakness. To the jury, it looked like guilt. The media devoured every moment. Newspapers printed courtroom sketches of Luciano sitting impassively beside his attorneys, headlines calling him, the Lord of Vice, the Empire in Chains, the businessman of sin. The public couldn't look away. For them, this was more than justice, it was a morality tale. A story of a man who had risen too high, believed himself untouchable, and was finally being brought down to earth. Dewey's closing argument was pure theater. He described the systematic degradation of women, the manipulation of poverty and desperation, and the transformation of crime into industry. This man, he declared, pointing at Luciano, is not merely a criminal. He is a corporation of evil, a man who turned vice into a business plan. The courtroom fell silent. It didn't matter that much of the case was built on inference. Dewey had already won the moral verdict. When the jury retired to deliberate, Luciano sat in silence, staring at the floor. For the first time, his composure cracked, just slightly. He understood that the trial wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about image. America needed a villain, and he was perfect for the role. The immigrant kid who rose too far, too fast. The man who made the American dream out of crime. The system he built had no defense against symbolism. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty, on 62 counts. The words hung in the air like gunfire. Luciano showed no emotion. The judge, Robert C. Taylor, sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some women cried, others applauded. Reporters raced to phones. Dewey, standing tall, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, knowing his victory would propel him into national fame. Luciano's only reaction was a small, cold smile. 50 years, he murmured. That's a long time to think. As guards approached, he adjusted his tie, as though preparing for a dinner engagement. He turned briefly toward Dewey and said, softly but clearly, "You did good, counselor. You learned from the best." Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Crowds gathered around the police van, cheering, jeering, shouting his name. To some, he was a villain brought to justice, to others, a fallen hero, the man who had given the underworld order and dignity. The world's most powerful criminal was now a prisoner, and yet, as he disappeared behind the barred windows of the transport van, the city he once ruled still pulsed with his influence. In the weeks that followed, New York celebrated Dewey's victory. Politicians praised his courage, the newspapers called it a triumph of law, and the police toasted the end of organized vice. But beneath the applause, the machinery of Luciano's empire kept turning. His lieutenants adjusted, profits continued, and corruption remained. The commission endured, quieter, more cautious, but alive. Dewey had won the battle, but Luciano had built something larger than himself. In prison, as the headlines faded, Luciano began a new kind of reflection. The man who had restructured the mafia into a global system was now confined to a cell, and yet, even there, he remained a teacher. His empire was no longer on the streets, it was in the minds of those he had trained. The trial had stripped him of freedom, but not of influence. The law had punished the man, but the idea, the method, would continue to rule. In that sense, the courtroom was less his downfall and more his transformation. The public saw a conviction. Luciano saw legacy. He had become a myth, a cautionary tale, a symbol of the thin line between power and prison. And deep down, he knew the truth, no verdict could erase the structure he had built. The system would live on, long after the gavel fell. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano, a cage meant to silence the most powerful criminal mind of the 20th century. Yet, as history would prove, walls and bars could not contain his influence. If anything, they distilled it. Behind the iron gates of Dannemora prison, known grimly as Little Siberia, for its isolation and brutality, Luciano began his next transformation. The world saw a convict. His followers saw a king in exile. The empire he had built didn't vanish when the cell door closed, it adapted, evolving under his watchful eye. He was no longer the public face of organized crime, he had become its ghost, ruling through whispers and proxies. Luciano entered prison with the calm of a man checking into a long-term office. He never complained, never begged for favors. He observed the system, the guards, the routines, the hierarchy, and began mapping it out as if it were another business venture. Within months, he established quiet control over the inmate black market, tobacco, gambling, and contraband passed through his approval. He never handled anything directly, but everyone knew who gave permission. It was the same model he had perfected on the streets, invisible leadership through structure. He also began to rebuild his external communications. His lieutenants, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese, arranged coded messages through visitors, lawyers, and corrupt officials. Cigarettes became signals, letters became reports, and conversations about old friends masked ongoing business deals. Luciano once joked to a guard, "You can take me out of my office, but the office still runs." And indeed, it did. The commission continued to meet, profits continued to flow, and Luciano's opinion still carried the weight of law. Ironically, his imprisonment elevated him to near-mythic status within the mafia. Among the younger mobsters rising in the late 1930s, Luciano was no longer just a leader, he was a legend. His name was spoken in hushed tones, his decisions quoted like scripture. From coast to coast, gangsters studied the Luciano model as if it were doctrine. The commission he had created operated almost religiously, interpreting what Lucky would have wanted when resolving disputes. His imprisonment had stripped him of freedom but gifted him immortality. Still, prison was not kind to his pride. The once immaculate suits were replaced by coarse uniforms. His luxury cigars became cheap tobacco. The silence of the cell pressed against him, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time in years, Luciano was forced to confront himself, not as a boss or strategist, but as a man. He began to read philosophy, law, and history. He studied power in every form, from Machiavelli to Napoleon, searching for lessons about downfall and endurance. His cell became his office, his reflection his new ally. Every empire, he wrote in a letter to Costello, needs a man who can run it from the shadows. Outside, the world was changing fast. The 1940s brought war, and with it, opportunity. As America prepared for World War II, New York's ports became critical supply lines. But the docks were chaotic, plagued by labor disputes and sabotage fears. U-boats stalked the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships near American shores. The U.S. Navy, desperate for security, turned to an unlikely source, the underworld. Naval intelligence knew that the mafia controlled the docks. They needed cooperation, and that meant one name, Lucky Luciano. Through intermediaries, the government reached out. In exchange for his assistance, they offered better conditions, and possibly a reduced sentence. Luciano, ever the strategist, saw the irony clearly, the same nation that condemned him as a criminal now needed him as a patriot. He agreed, on one condition, his help would remain secret. Thus began Operation Underworld, one of the strangest alliances in American history. From his prison cell, Luciano gave orders to his network, ensuring dockworkers cooperated with Navy agents, preventing strikes, and rooting out suspected saboteurs. His lieutenants, especially Costello and Lansky, acted as intermediaries, translating government requests into mafia action. Within months, the docks were running smoothly, and reports of sabotage vanished. Luciano had, in effect, become a wartime asset. Officially, he remained a convict. Unofficially, he was working for the United States government. This alliance blurred every moral line. Newspapers never reported it, but those inside intelligence circles knew. Some praised it as pragmatic, others saw it as scandalous. For Luciano, it was vindication. He had always said the mafia was simply business, and now, even the government agreed, treating him like a necessary evil. "We did what they couldn't," he told a visitor years later. "We made the docks run on time." In prison, Luciano's behavior remained disciplined. He bribed guards, not for comfort, but for information, updates from the outside world. Every report mattered: who was rising, who was falling, who was loyal. His mind stayed sharp, always planning. He never allowed despair to take root. When one younger inmate asked him how he stayed so calm, Luciano replied, "Control isn't about power. It's about patience." Meanwhile, his enemies outside the walls maneuvered. Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, was plotting his own return to power. He saw Luciano's imprisonment as an opening, a chance to reshape the commission in his own image. Costello, acting as Luciano's representative, tried to keep balance, but tensions simmered. Even from behind bars, Luciano sensed the shifting tides. He wrote to Lansky, warning him, "If they ever forget the system, remind them, no one man runs it. The system runs itself." It was both prophecy and warning. Years passed, and Luciano's health declined. Still, he remained influential. Guards noted how visitors, politicians, lawyers, even businessmen, treated him with deference, as if he were still seated in a Manhattan penthouse. He was aging, yes, but never defeated. His charisma remained magnetic, his authority intact. Every conversation with him carried the weight of command. By 1945, with the war over, the Navy quietly acknowledged his cooperation. Political pressure mounted for his release. Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, faced a moral dilemma: the same man he had imprisoned had helped his country win a war. Dewey eventually approved a deal: Luciano's sentence would be commuted in exchange for deportation to Italy. It was a compromise between justice and pragmatism. When Luciano heard the news, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. "They're not setting me free," he said. "They're moving the office overseas." In February 1946, after nearly a decade behind bars, Luciano walked out of prison a thinner, older version of the man who had entered. His smile remained, though now it carried the weight of experience. The guards watched him leave with quiet respect. Some whispered that even in prison, he had never really been confined. As he boarded the ship that would take him back to Italy, Luciano looked back at the distant skyline of New York. The city had changed, but its pulse was still his. He had ruled it from boardrooms, backrooms, and even from a cell. Power, he realized, wasn't about proximity, it was about permanence. And as the ship pulled away, the ocean stretching wide before him, he smiled faintly. The world believed the legend of Lucky Luciano had ended behind bars. But those who understood power, truly understood it, knew the truth. The king was not dead. He had simply changed thrones. When Lucky Luciano set foot on Italian soil in 1946, he was no longer the powerful Don of New York, but a man cast into exile, stripped of citizenship, fortune, and authority. Yet exile did not mean irrelevance. History has a way of keeping its architects close, and the empire Luciano had built across the ocean still pulsed with life. He had spent a decade behind bars mastering patience, and now that patience became his weapon. Italy was meant to be his prison, but he saw it differently: a new frontier, a laboratory for reinvention. The world he returned to was fractured. Post-war Italy was a landscape of ruin, bombed cities, hungry civilians, and black markets thriving under the chaos of reconstruction. Sicily, his birthplace, had become a breeding ground for desperation and opportunity alike. American troops occupied the region, and the local mafia, long suppressed under Mussolini, was resurrecting itself in the shadows. Into this volatile environment walked a man who understood chaos better than anyone. Luciano was home, and for the first time in decades, invisible again. At first, he kept a low profile, living quietly in Naples under surveillance. He was officially forbidden from leaving the city without permission, and the Italian government, under pressure from the Americans, kept a close watch. But the truth was, no one could truly contain him. He began receiving visitors, old allies, new entrepreneurs, and even foreign gangsters seeking his advice. They came not out of loyalty, but reverence. To them, Luciano wasn't just a man, he was the blueprint. The architect of modern crime had returned to Europe, and everyone wanted to learn from him. Through these quiet meetings, Luciano began rebuilding his influence, not as a boss, but as a consultant of the underworld. He no longer commanded soldiers or controlled rackets directly, instead, he offered structure, strategy. His reputation alone could unite factions that otherwise would have slit each other's throats. Mafia leaders in Sicily began to reorganize using the same commission model he had pioneered in America. In essence, Luciano exported his own creation, transforming the Sicilian mafia from scattered rural gangs into an organized syndicate with global reach. But Italy was only part of the plan. Luciano's vision was still transatlantic. Using contacts like Meyer Lansky, who remained active in Havana and Las Vegas, Luciano became involved in what historians would later call the Havana Connection, a covert alliance between American and Sicilian mafia families, funneled through the growing Cuban casino industry. Havana was neutral ground, free from U.S. jurisdiction, and a paradise for money laundering. Luciano couldn't return to America, but through Havana, he could touch it again. In 1947, he traveled there secretly, defying his deportation terms. The Havana Conference, organized by Lansky, gathered the most powerful mob bosses in the world, from the Five Families to the Chicago Outfit, from Jewish syndicates to Latin American traffickers. The meeting was grand, held at the Hotel Nacional, a symbol of wealth and decadence. Luciano walked into the hall to a standing ovation. The room fell silent as he raised his hand. The king had returned. That conference wasn't merely symbolic, it was operational. Luciano outlined the next phase of organized crime, globalization. The American mafia would expand into international drug trafficking, using Sicily and Marseille as key transit points for heroin moving into the United States. In exchange, profits would flow back to European networks, ensuring cooperation. It was the birth of what would later be known as the French Connection, and though Luciano would never handle a shipment himself, his fingerprints were all over it. But power, as always, breeds conflict. Not everyone welcomed his return. Some American bosses, like Vito Genovese, saw Luciano's exile as permanent, an opportunity to dominate the commission without his shadow looming over them. Genovese, cunning and ambitious, began undercutting Luciano's influence, reshaping the mafia in his image. Rumors circulated that he intended to eliminate all remaining traces of the old order. In response, Luciano remained calm. He had no army left, no guns to call upon, but he had something Genovese lacked: respect. Among the old guard, Luciano's name still carried weight, and that was a weapon more dangerous than any bullet. Still, the strain was visible. Luciano's movements were monitored by the FBI, Italian police, and international agencies. Every letter, every visit, every rumor was recorded. He grew paranoid but philosophical. He spent hours pacing his apartment, staring at the Bay of Naples, replaying his life in his mind, every rise, every betrayal. He once told a confidant, "They can follow me all they want. The only thing they'll ever catch is my shadow." As the years passed, the world around him changed. The mafia had evolved beyond his imagination, diversified into narcotics, real estate, entertainment, politics. The structure he built had become self-sustaining, just as he intended. And yet, he felt a quiet melancholy. The empire he created no longer belonged to him. He had become its ghost, the teacher whose students no longer needed lessons. Despite his isolation, Luciano retained his sense of purpose. He was often seen walking through Naples, impeccably dressed, greeting locals who had no idea of the power that once radiated from him. He frequented cafes, smoked his favorite Turkish cigarettes, and entertained visitors from across the world. Some came for business, others for history. To the young mafiosi, meeting Lucky Luciano was like meeting a myth. He spoke rarely of America, but when he did, it was with affection, not bitterness. "New York made me," he told an Italian journalist. "It gave me everything: money, power, prison, and wisdom. You can't ask for more from a city." He never forgave the betrayal of his trial, but he also never blamed it. To him, it was the price of empire. In the 1950s, Luciano's name surfaced again in U.S. investigations linking him to heroin trafficking networks. Though no direct evidence ever tied him to active operations, the allegations reignited public fascination. The newspapers called him the exiled godfather, the shadow of the syndicate, the king in exile. To law enforcement, he remained a symbol of organized crime's endurance. To gangsters, he was the ghost who still whispered from across the sea. But behind the myth, Luciano was aging. His health deteriorated, heart problems, fatigue, and a deep loneliness that even power couldn't cure. He began to reflect not on money or crime, but on meaning. He had spent his life building systems that controlled men, but he couldn't control time. In private moments, he admitted regret, not for his crimes, but for the cost of them. "You don't win in this life," he told a friend. "You just learn to lose slower." His final years were quiet but never empty. He lived modestly in Naples, often visited by old associates and curious journalists. In 1962, he was approached by a Hollywood producer seeking to make a film about his life. The idea fascinated him, the thought of his story, cleaned up and dramatized, living forever on screen. He agreed to meet the producer at the Naples airport to discuss the project. On January 26, 1962, as the producer's car pulled up to the terminal, Luciano stepped forward to greet him. He smiled, extended his hand, and suddenly, his body stiffened. Witnesses said he gasped once, as if surprised, then collapsed to the ground. The heart that had ruled an empire had finally stopped. He died instantly. In his pocket was a folded note containing the address of the meeting and a small gold cross, the only sentimental object he ever kept. The Italian police found him lying face up, his hat beside him, a faint smile still on his face. It was a peaceful end to a life of chaos. Luciano was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, a final irony, returning to the city that had made and destroyed him. At his funeral, dozens of men in dark suits stood silently, their faces hidden behind sunglasses. The commission sent flowers. So did Lansky. No one spoke, they didn't need to. The man who had given crime its structure had finally left the stage. In death, Lucky Luciano achieved what he had always sought: permanence. His empire survived, his code endured, and his ideas became the DNA of modern organized crime. He died in exile, but his system ruled the world. After Luciano's death, his shadow lingered like a blueprint etched into the world of organized crime. His protégés, Costello, Lansky, and Gambino, carried his teachings forward, treating his system as sacred scripture. The commission he built continued to govern, not by blood, but by balance. His principles, discipline, order, secrecy, had outlived the man who wrote them. Across the ocean, the Sicilian mafia adopted his structure, merging the traditions of the old world with the efficiency of the new. Smugglers, drug traffickers, and union bosses all followed the Luciano model: compartmentalize, control, and endure. He had proven that crime could be managed like an enterprise, and his students spread that philosophy worldwide. Even his enemies respected him. Lawmen studied his organization to design new policing methods, businessmen unknowingly mimicked his tactics in boardrooms. Delegation, deniability, and invisible leadership, these were Luciano's true inventions. In time, he became myth more than memory, a teacher whose lessons transcended morality. His disciples didn't just inherit an empire, they inherited a mindset. To them, he wasn't gone. He was a principle, a formula for power that still governed every decision they made. Lucky Luciano had become the ghost who ruled through the systems he created. Lucky Luciano's story ends not with his death, but with the endurance of his design. He proved that power isn't noise, it's structure. The Commission, his ultimate creation, survived decades of arrests, betrayals, and wars. Its framework seeped into business, politics, and global crime alike. He taught the world that control could exist without visibility, that fear could be replaced by discipline, and that loyalty could be engineered. His empire was criminal, but its logic was timeless, a reflection of the very institutions that tried to destroy him. In the quiet decades after his death, his name became legend, the man who civilized the underworld. His methods shaped not just the mafia but the psychology of modern power. Every syndicate, every secret organization, every silent boardroom still carries his echo. Luciano once said, "I didn't invent the mafia. I just gave it order." That order became his immortality. Whether in crime, politics, or commerce, his blueprint remains, proof that systems, once perfected, outlive their creators. Lucky Luciano may have died in exile, but his design governs the world's darkest corridors still.